Funny thing about old shoes, the billionaire said with a quiet laugh, staring at the waitress from across the marble dining room. They usually tell you exactly where someone belongs. Rain hammered against the tall glass windows of Bellamy's steakhouse, turning the Manhattan streets outside into rivers of gold and blurred headlights. Inside, everything glowed warm and expensive. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above white linen tables. Piano music floated softly through the air. Men in tailored suits discussed mergers worth hundreds of millions of dollars, while women in silk dresses lifted wine glasses that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a week. And near the entrance, standing beneath the soft amber lights while trying to press a loose piece of tape back onto the sole of her shoe, Claire Bennett pretended not to notice anyone looking at her. Her fingers moved quickly, calmly. She had done this before. The black leather flats were old enough to remember winters that no longer existed. The edges had faded gray. Tiny cracks spread across the sides like dried riverbeds. One heel leaned slightly inward from years of double shifts and subway stairs and walking 6 long blocks home after midnight to save money on cab fare. But they were clean. Always clean. Claire smoothed the tape one last time just as headlights swept across the wet sidewalk outside. A long black Rolls-Royce stopped in front of the restaurant. Every valet near the curb straightened immediately. The rear door opened slowly, and Ethan Blackwood stepped out into the rain holding nothing but a silver umbrella and the kind of confidence money teaches men too early. At 38, Ethan carried wealth the way generals carried medals. Effortlessly. His charcoal coat fit perfectly across broad shoulders. His watch flashed beneath the city lights for half a second as he adjusted his cufflinks. Even the rain seemed careful around him. Claire lowered her eyes and stepped aside as he entered the restaurant. But not before he noticed the shoes. His gaze dropped once. Brief. Sharp. Then returned to her face. Most men looked at waitresses the way they looked at furniture. Ethan Blackwood looked at people like balance sheets. Evaluating. Sorting. Measuring value. The corner of his mouth lifted faintly. "Rough night?" he asked. Claire blinked softly. "Excuse me, sir?" His eyes flicked downward again toward the taped sole. Those shoes. A couple standing near the hostess stand glanced over. Ethan's smile remained calm. Polite. Dangerous in the way polished people often were. "I didn't realize vintage suffering was back in style." The hostess laughed nervously before quickly stopping herself. Claire felt heat rise behind her cheeks, but her face remained composed. Quiet. Still. Ethan waited for embarrassment. Most people rushed to defend themselves around him. They apologized. Explained. Shrunk. Claire simply looked down at the shoes for a moment before answering softly. "They still work." Something about the way she said it made the silence around them stretch strangely long. Ethan studied her more carefully now. The waitress uniform was simple. Black skirt. White shirt. Hair tied back neatly. No jewelry except for a thin silver necklace resting against her collarbone. Yet there was something deeply unbothered about her. Something steady. He had spent years around politicians, executives, celebrities, and investors. He knew insecurity the second it entered a room. This woman didn't seem ashamed. That irritated him more than it should have. "Well," he said lightly, removing his gloves, "that's one way to define survival." Claire gave a small nod and reached for the menus near the hostess stand. "Your guests are already seated, Mr. Blackwood." Ethan paused. "You know who I am?" "Everyone here does." "And you're not impressed?" Her eyes lifted finally to meet his. Blue-gray, calm as winter water. "Should I be?" For the briefest second, Ethan Blackwood forgot the sound of the rain. Then one of his investors called from across the dining room. "Ethan, about time." The moment disappeared. Ethan smirked once, more to himself than to her, before walking deeper into the restaurant. But halfway across the room, he glanced back. Claire was kneeling again near the entrance, pressing the edge of the tape carefully against the worn sole before standing up and returning to work as if nothing had happened at all. No anger. No humiliation. No performance. Just quiet dignity moving beneath chandelier light, while rain fell endlessly outside the windows of Manhattan. By 9:30, the rain had turned heavier, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers while Bellamy's steakhouse glowed warm and golden against the storm. Claire Bennett moved through the dining room with practiced precision, balancing trays, refilling glasses, and answering quiet requests before customers even asked them aloud. She had learned long ago that wealthy people loved feeling understood before they had to speak. Table 12 needs another bottle of Napa Cabernet, Olivia whispered as she rushed past carrying dessert plates. Claire nodded immediately. Already on the way. Olivia slowed for half a second beside her. You okay? Claire glanced toward the far side of the dining room where Ethan Blackwood sat surrounded by investors in $1,000 suits. Laughter rolled across the table again. Expensive. Effortless. She looked away just as quickly. I am working, she said softly. Olivia gave her a knowing look. That man has been impossible all night. Claire picked up the wine bottle carefully. Some people think money gives them permission to forget manners. Then she walked toward the Blackwood table before Olivia could answer. Ethan barely noticed her approach at first. He was in the middle of explaining a hotel acquisition somewhere in Miami, while one of the investors beside him nodded eagerly, like a student trying to impress a professor. Numbers moved smoothly through Ethan's voice. 20 million. 40%. Market leverage. Exit strategy. He spoke the language of power fluently. But halfway through his sentence, he stopped. Claire had arrived beside the table carrying the bottle of wine against one shoulder. The overhead chandelier caught the silver necklace at her throat for just a second before the light disappeared again. Another Cabernet for the table, she said calmly. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her again with the same quiet amusement from earlier. Tell me something, Claire. Her hands paused briefly near the wine glasses. Yes, sir. Do those shoes survive every storm, or just Manhattan winters? One of the younger investors laughed immediately. Another smirked into his whiskey. Claire poured the wine carefully without spilling a single drop. Mostly storms, she answered. Interesting. Ethan swirled the bourbon in his glass slowly. You seem attached to them. Claire moved to the next glass. People usually are attached to things that stay. That answer earned a small silence from the table. Ethan noticed it. He also noticed the way Claire never rushed her words. Most employees became nervous around wealthy clients. Their voices tightened. Their smiles became fragile. Claire sounded calm enough to be discussing the weather. You know, one investor interrupted with a grin. Ethan can buy you a new pair tonight if he wants. Probably 10 pairs. A few more laughs spread around the table. Claire finally looked up. Not defensive. Not embarrassed. Just tired in a quiet way that somehow made everyone else seem louder. That is generous, she said politely. But these were a gift. Ethan rested his glass down slowly. From someone important, Claire folded the wine towel over her arm again. Very. Then she turned to leave. But one careless movement changed everything. A man near the edge of the table reached too quickly for his wine glass. His elbow clipped the stem. Red wine splashed across the white tablecloth and straight onto Claire's shoes. The room inhaled softly. Olivia froze near the service station. Claire looked down instantly. For the first time all night, real panic crossed her face. Not because of the tablecloth. Not because of the embarrassment. Because of the shoes. She dropped to one knee immediately beside the table and grabbed a napkin with trembling fingers. I am so sorry, the investor stammered. But Claire barely seemed to hear him. She dabbed carefully at the dark stains spreading across the worn leather, her breathing suddenly uneven beneath the restaurant lights. Ethan watched closely now. Too closely. There it was again. That strange protectiveness. She was treating the shoes like something alive. Like something fragile. Claire, Ethan said quietly. She did not answer. She kept cleaning the leather gently, almost desperately. They are just shoes, another investor muttered awkwardly. Claire stopped moving for 1 second. Only one. Then she lifted her eyes slowly from the stain. No, she said softly. They are not. The piano music continued somewhere in the background while rain crawled down the windows in silver streams. Ethan stared at her longer than necessary. Something had shifted in the room. The laughter was gone now. The jokes too. Even the investors seemed uncomfortable without understanding why. Claire rose carefully to her feet after blotting the stain as best she could. She smoothed her apron once, steadying herself, calm returning piece by piece. Ethan noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Would you like a break? He asked before he could stop himself. Claire blinked once, surprised by the question. No, sir. You sure? She looked down at the shoes again before answering. Some things survive because they have to. Then she walked away beneath the amber lights while Ethan Blackwood sat motionless at the center of the table, listening to the sound of her fading footsteps against polished marble floors while something unfamiliar settled heavily inside his chest. The rain finally slowed close to midnight, but the city still looked drowned beneath the silver haze covering Manhattan. Inside Bellamy's steakhouse, the dinner rush had faded into softer conversations and half-empty glasses while exhausted waiters stacked plates behind the kitchen doors. Claire Bennett stood alone near the service station, carefully polishing silverware beneath a dim, hanging light. Most nights, the quiet after closing felt peaceful. Tonight, it felt heavy. Her shoes were drying beside the heater vent near the back hallway. The wine stain had darkened the leather despite everything she tried. Claire stared at them for a long moment before lowering her eyes again. "You should have let him buy you new ones," Olivia said softly while tying her coat. Claire gave a faint smile without looking up. People always think replacing something is easier than understanding it. Olivia leaned against the counter. "Still, Ethan Blackwood offering concern? That is practically a miracle." Claire laughed quietly under her breath for the first time all evening. It was not concern. Then what was it? Claire folded another napkin carefully. Curiosity. Olivia studied her for a second. "You know, most girls here would have cried after that little performance at table 7. Claire finally glanced up. Crying would not change the shoes. Before Olivia could answer, the restaurant doors opened again. Cold air swept across the dining room, carrying the smell of wet pavement and winter rain. Claire looked toward the entrance automatically. An elderly woman stood just outside the doorway beneath the weak glow of the streetlights. She looked painfully thin beneath an oversized gray coat. Her silver hair clung damply against her forehead while her hands trembled around the handle of a worn handbag. One of the younger hostesses frowned immediately. "We are closed, ma'am." The woman nodded apologetically. "I know. I just needed to get out of the rain for a moment." Her voice sounded tired in the way only loneliness could make it sound. The hostess hesitated awkwardly. "I am sorry, but private guests are still inside." Claire had already removed her apron before the sentence even finished. She crossed the dining room quietly and opened the door wider without saying a word. Warm air spilled into the stormy night. "Please come in," Claire said gently. The older woman looked startled. "Oh no, sweetheart, I do not want to cause trouble." "You are freezing." Claire reached carefully for her arm. "Come sit down for a minute." Across the room, Ethan Blackwood emerged from a private meeting near the bar while buttoning his coat. Two investors followed behind him, discussing numbers in low voices. But Ethan stopped walking when he noticed Claire helping the elderly woman toward a booth near the windows. The hostess approached nervously. "Sir, I am very sorry about this. She just came in from the street," and Ethan lifted a hand slightly, quieting her. His eyes remained fixed on Claire. The old woman lowered herself slowly into the booth, while Claire disappeared briefly into the kitchen. A minute later, she returned carrying a steaming mug with both hands. "Chamomile tea," she said softly. "It helps warm you up faster." The woman smiled weakly. "You are very kind." Claire shrugged lightly. "It is just tea." "No," the woman whispered, wrapping trembling fingers around the cup. "It is not." Ethan watched the exchange from across the room without understanding why he had not left yet. Something about Claire unsettled him in ways expensive boardrooms never could. She moved through the world without calculation, without performance. Men like Ethan spent entire lives trying to control how they were seen. Claire Bennett seemed completely uninterested in being seen at all. One investor glanced toward the booth dismissively. "You should probably have security remove her before other people start wandering in." Ethan did not answer immediately. Claire had crouched beside the elderly woman now, listening carefully while the woman spoke in a voice too soft to hear from across the room. Then something strange happened. The older woman's eyes drifted downward toward the heater vent near the hallway, toward the worn black shoes drying beside it. Her entire expression changed. The teacup trembled slightly in her hands. "No," she whispered faintly. Claire blinked. "Ma'am." The woman slowly rose from the booth despite Claire trying to steady her. Her eyes never left the shoes. Ethan felt the room shift somehow before a single word was spoken. The woman crossed the dining room carefully, one step at a time, then stopped directly in front of the shoes near the vent. Her fingers lifted toward them slowly, as if touching something sacred. Claire froze beside her. "You still wear them," the woman whispered. The sound of silverware clinking stopped somewhere behind the kitchen doors. Ethan stared across the room while the old woman looked at Claire with tears filling her tired eyes. Real tears. Quiet ones. After all this time, she said softly. You still kept them. Claire's face lost color completely. Mrs. Whitmore. Ethan's heartbeat slowed strangely inside his chest at the name. Eleanor Whitmore. Even the investors beside him straightened immediately. Everyone in New York finance knew that name. The woman who built Whitmore Capital from nothing 40 years ago. The woman powerful men still spoke about carefully in private rooms. Ethan looked back at the worn shoes beside the heater vent. Then at Claire Bennett standing silently beneath the dim restaurant lights while one of the most respected women in Manhattan stared at her like she was seeing family. No one in Bellamy's steakhouse moved for several seconds. Even the piano player near the bar had stopped mid-song without realizing it. Rain slid slowly down the tall windows while Eleanor Whitmore stood beneath the dim hallway light, staring at the worn black shoes beside the heater vent like they belonged to another lifetime. Claire Bennett looked suddenly younger somehow. Smaller. Not weak. Just exposed in a way Ethan Blackwood had not seen before. Mrs. Whitmore. Claire repeated softly, still stunned. Eleanor turned toward her with trembling eyes. I searched for you. Claire swallowed hard. You should not be standing. And you should not still be wearing these shoes. Eleanor's voice cracked gently beneath the weight of emotion. Ethan stared from across the dining room, trying to connect the impossible image in front of him with the woman he knew from financial magazines and charity galas. Eleanor Whitmore did not visit restaurants alone in the middle of rainstorms. Eleanor Whitmore owned buildings people like Ethan spent years trying to buy. Yet now she looked at a waitress with something dangerously close to gratitude. Olivia slowly stepped backward toward the kitchen, understanding instinctively that whatever was happening no longer belonged to ordinary people. Claire carefully guided Eleanor back toward the booth near the windows. The older woman kept one hand wrapped lightly around Claire's wrist the entire time, as though afraid she might disappear again. Ethan remained standing near the center of the dining room, while his investors exchanged confused glances beside him. You know her? One whispered quietly. Ethan answered without taking his eyes off Claire. Everyone knows Eleanor Whitmore. But suddenly he realized no one in that room knew Claire Bennett at all. Eleanor settled carefully into the booth, while Claire placed another napkin beneath the warm teacup. Her movements remained calm, but Ethan noticed the slight tremble in her fingers. You vanished, Eleanor said softly. Claire lowered her eyes. Life became busy. Eleanor gave a faint, sad smile. That sounds like something people say when life became painful. Claire did not answer immediately. Outside, a taxi splashed through rainwater near the curb, while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. The city kept moving. But inside Bellamy's, time felt strangely suspended. Ethan found himself walking toward the booth before he fully decided to. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully once he reached the table. Eleanor looked up slowly. Recognition crossed her face immediately. Ethan Blackwood. He gave a respectful nod. I did not realize you were in the city tonight. Neither did I. Her tired eyes softened briefly. Funny how storms decide things for us. Ethan almost smiled at that, but his attention shifted quickly back toward Claire. You two know each other? Claire looked uncomfortable instantly. Eleanor answered before she could. This young woman saved my life. Silence settled over the table like falling snow. Ethan blinked once, certain he had misheard. What? Eleanor folded both hands around the warm teacup. Last winter, during the blizzard. Claire immediately shook her head. Mrs. Whitmore, you do not have to. Yes, Eleanor interrupted gently. I do. Her eyes drifted toward the shoes again. I was leaving a charity board meeting downtown when my driver suffered a heart episode behind the wheel. The car slid into a snowbank near 57th Street. Ethan remembered that storm. 12 inches of snow overnight. Entire blocks shut down. People drove past. Eleanor continued quietly. Most never even slowed down. Claire looked down at her lap now, clearly wishing the story would end. But Eleanor's voice carried the kind of calm truth impossible to interrupt. Then she appeared. Ethan felt something tighten slowly in his chest. She was walking home after a double shift, wearing those shoes. Eleanor smiled faintly through tired eyes. I remember because they were already falling apart. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Whitmore, you carried me almost 2 miles through snow. The entire restaurant felt silent enough to hear breathing. Ethan stared at Claire, unable to reconcile the image forming in his mind. Claire Bennett walking through a blizzard carrying one of the most powerful women in New York, while those worn shoes broke apart beneath the storm. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Eleanor continued softly. Ambulances could not reach us. My phone died. My driver was unconscious. And this young woman refused to leave me there. Claire finally spoke quietly. Anyone would have helped. Ethan looked at her immediately. Eleanor did too. But the older woman smiled sadly. No, sweetheart. They would not. Claire had no answer for that. Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the booth. Ethan noticed it. He also noticed something else. Shame. Not because she regretted helping. Because she hated attention for it. The shoes were ruined afterward, Eleanor whispered. Salt stains. Torn soles. Water damage. Her eyes glistened again. I offered to buy her anything she wanted. Ethan's gaze lowered slowly toward the worn leather near the hallway heater. Suddenly the tape holding the sole together no longer looked pathetic. It looked loyal. But she only accepted one pair. Eleanor finished softly. These. Ethan felt the room tilt quietly around him. Earlier that night he had laughed at those shoes in front of investors and millionaires beneath crystal chandeliers. He had reduced them to poverty, cheapness, failure. But standing there now beneath the soft restaurant lights, Ethan Blackwood realized he had mocked the very thing that once carried kindness through a blizzard while the rest of the city kept driving past. The rain had stopped completely by the time the last investors quietly left Bellamy's Steakhouse, but Ethan Blackwood still had not moved from the booth near the windows. The city outside shimmered wet and silver beneath midnight lights while traffic drifted slowly through Manhattan like tired rivers of glass. Across from him, Eleanor Whitmore held her tea with both hands while Claire Bennett stood beside the table uncertainly, as though she wanted the entire conversation to disappear into the storm and never return. You never told me your name that night, Eleanor said softly. Claire gave a small shrug. You needed a hospital more than introductions. Eleanor smiled faintly. And afterward you vanished before sunrise. Claire looked embarrassed by the attention. You were safe. Ethan remained silent, but his mind replayed every careless word he had spoken earlier that evening. Vintage suffering. Rough night. Those shoes belong in a museum. The sentences sounded uglier now. Smaller somehow. He had spent years believing intelligence could be measured by confidence, success by appearance, character by status. Yet Claire Bennett had walked into a blizzard carrying humanity while he had stood beneath chandeliers making jokes about shoes. Olivia quietly shut down the final section of the dining room before disappearing into the kitchen with the rest of the staff, leaving the restaurant strangely intimate beneath the low amber lights. Eleanor looked toward Ethan suddenly. You remember your first office? Ethan blinked once, caught off guard. Of course. Tiny little place downtown with broken elevators and no heat after 6 o'clock. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. That building should have been condemned. You were 28 and impossible. Eleanor's eyes warmed with memory, but determined. Claire listened quietly while polishing a water glass near the booth, clearly trying to give them privacy without actually leaving. Most banks laughed at your proposal, Eleanor continued. You had confidence, vision, but no collateral. Ethan leaned back slowly. You gave me a chance. Eleanor nodded faintly. Because once upon a time, someone gave me one. The restaurant fell silent again except for the distant hum of refrigerators behind the bar. Ethan had heard people call Eleanor Whitmore ruthless for decades. Brilliant. Untouchable. Cold. Yet tonight she looked softer than any boardroom had ever allowed her to be. You know what I remember most about that storm? Eleanor asked quietly, turning back toward Claire. Claire shook her head once. You kept apologizing for your shoes. Claire's eyes lowered immediately. They were soaked. No, Eleanor smiled sadly. They were carrying me. Ethan felt those words land somewhere deep and uncomfortable inside him. Claire folded the towel carefully beside the glass. Mrs. Whitmore, I really do not think this is necessary. Necessary? Eleanor repeated gently. Child, do you know how many people walk past suffering every day because stopping would inconvenience them? Claire said nothing. You stopped. Ethan stared down at his untouched bourbon. He suddenly remembered the storm Eleanor mentioned. He had been in Aspen that week for a luxury conference while private drivers transported guests between heated hotels. Somewhere in the same city, Claire Bennett had been walking through snow carrying a stranger while her shoes came apart beneath her feet. The contrast made him feel strangely hollow. "Why keep wearing them?" he asked quietly before he could stop himself. Claire looked toward him for the first time in several minutes. There was no anger in her face now. Somehow that felt worse. "Because they remind me who I was before life became difficult." Ethan frowned slightly. Most people would want to forget difficult times. Claire's fingers brushed lightly against the silver necklace at her throat. "That is because most people confuse difficult with meaningless." Eleanor watched her with visible affection. "You see why I searched for her?" Ethan nodded slowly before realizing he had done it. Claire moved toward the heater vent and picked up the shoes carefully. The leather still carried dark stains from the spilled wine earlier that night. She cleaned them gently with a folded cloth while the room remained quiet. Ethan noticed how careful she was. Not obsessive, grateful, like someone handling memories instead of objects. "I mocked them tonight," he admitted suddenly. Claire paused for half a second, but did not look up. "Yes." Ethan almost expected bitterness in her voice. There was none. That somehow made the shame sharper. "Why did you not say anything?" Claire slipped the shoes back on slowly. "Would it have mattered?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again, because the answer embarrassed him. Earlier that night, it would not have mattered at all. He would have dismissed the story, smiled politely, returned to his wine and investment discussions. He had been too busy measuring value by price tags to recognize dignity standing directly in front of him. Eleanor rose carefully from the booth, and Claire immediately stepped forward to help steady her. The older woman squeezed her hand gently. "Still taking care of everyone except yourself." Claire smiled softly. "Somebody has to." Eleanor reached into her handbag and removed a small cream-colored envelope. "I came tonight because I finally found your address through the shelter downtown." Claire's expression changed instantly. "You went there?" "Every month." Eleanor placed the envelope carefully into Claire's hand. "They told me you still volunteer every Sunday." Ethan looked up sharply at that. Claire immediately looked uncomfortable again. "Mrs. Whitmore, open it later," Eleanor interrupted gently. Claire glanced down at the envelope but did not move. Ethan noticed something then. Claire Bennett never looked impressed by money. Not once all evening. Not by his watch. Not by Eleanor's reputation. Not even by whatever rested inside that envelope. She only looked overwhelmed by kindness. And for the first time in years, Ethan Blackwood realized those were not the same thing. The clock behind the bar read 12:43 in the morning when Eleanor Whitmore finally prepared to leave Bellamy's Steakhouse. Outside, Manhattan glistened beneath fresh rain while steam curled upward from subway grates and yellow taxis drifted through the sleeping city like floating lanterns. Claire Bennett helped Eleanor into her coat near the entrance with the same quiet care she gave everyone else all night. Gentle, unhurried, human. Ethan Blackwood stood several feet away watching silently while the valet pulled Eleanor's car toward the curb. He had not checked his phone in nearly an hour. That alone would have shocked everyone who worked for him. "You should let my driver take you home," Claire said softly while adjusting Eleanor's scarf. "It is late." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You always worry about other people first." Claire lowered her eyes with a shy smile that seemed too sincere for Manhattan. "Somebody worried about me once." Ethan noticed the sentence immediately. So did Eleanor. The older woman reached up slowly and touched Claire's cheek for a brief moment. "Do not let this city harden you." Claire gave a tiny nod. "I am trying." The black sedan rolled to the curb outside. Before leaving, Eleanor turned toward Ethan one last time. "Take care of your words, Mr. Blackwood." Ethan straightened slightly. "Excuse me." Eleanor glanced toward Claire's worn shoes near the doorway. Money can replace almost everything except the moment someone realizes you look down on them. Then she stepped into the car and disappeared into the rainy Manhattan night. Silence lingered near the entrance after the taillights faded away. Claire stood still for a second longer before quietly locking the front doors. Ethan remained where he was, watching her, thinking. The restaurant no longer looked the same to him. Earlier that evening Bellamy's had felt impressive, powerful. Now all he could see was how small expensive people became when kindness entered the room. Claire returned to the service station and began stacking menus for the morning shift. Ethan approached slowly, unsure why his chest felt strangely heavy. "You volunteer at a shelter?" he asked quietly. Claire did not stop working. "Yes. Every Sunday. Usually." Ethan slid his hands into his coat pockets. "Why?" Claire looked genuinely confused by the question. People need help. There are thousands of people who need help. I know. Ethan frowned slightly. Then why spend your only day off there? Claire stacked another menu carefully before answering. Because nobody should feel invisible. The words settled between them softly. Ethan looked at her differently now. Earlier he had seen a waitress with old shoes. Then a woman protecting a sentimental gift. But standing there beneath the dim restaurant lights after midnight, Claire Bennett suddenly felt deeper than all the polished people he usually surrounded himself with. What is in the envelope? He asked. Claire glanced toward the cream-colored envelope resting near the register. I have not opened it yet. You are not curious? A faint smile touched her face. Curious and entitled are different things. Ethan almost laughed quietly at that. Not because it was funny, because nobody spoke to him like this. Most people tried to impress him. Claire only answered honestly. She finally picked up the envelope and opened it carefully beneath the hanging light. A folded letter slipped into her hand first, then something else. Claire froze completely. Ethan noticed her breathing stop before he saw what she was holding. A check. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stared down at the number written across the paper. Ethan stepped closer instinctively, then stopped himself. Claire swallowed hard. Mrs. Whitmore. Ethan could only see part of the amount from where he stood, but it was enough to understand immediately. It was life-changing money. Enough to erase debt. Enough to leave Bellamy's forever. Enough to start over. Yet Claire did not look excited. She looked overwhelmed, almost frightened. Ethan watched her unfold the handwritten letter slowly. Her eyes moved across the page beneath the soft light while silence filled the empty restaurant. What does it say? He asked quietly after a moment. Claire hesitated before answering. She says kindness saved her life twice. Ethan frowned slightly. Twice. Claire lowered the letter carefully. The storm was the first time. And the second? Claire stared down at the paper for several long seconds before speaking. Last year her son died. Ethan felt the room grow still again. She said after the funeral, she stopped speaking to almost everyone. Claire's voice softened further. Then one day she saw me volunteering at the shelter downtown. Ethan listened silently while rainwater dripped softly outside the windows. She recognized the shoes, Claire whispered. And she said seeing me there reminded her the world was not completely empty yet. Ethan looked down slowly. Those shoes again. Always the shoes. Earlier they had looked cheap. Then meaningful. Now somehow they looked sacred. Claire folded the check back into the envelope carefully. Too carefully for someone holding that much money. You are not going to cash it? Ethan asked. Claire shook her head faintly. Not tonight. Most people would already be planning vacations. Claire looked at him then. Calm. Tired. Honest. Most people are exhausted from trying to become rich. Ethan held her gaze quietly. And you are not. Claire slipped the envelope gently into her bag before answering. I think people forget there are different kinds of poverty. Somewhere behind the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed softly beneath the silence. Ethan Blackwood stood motionless in the middle of the empty restaurant while a waitress wearing taped shoes quietly destroyed every definition of success he had spent his entire life believing. Claire Bennett left Bellamy's Steakhouse a little after 1:30 in the morning with the cream-colored envelope tucked carefully inside her worn canvas bag. The streets of Manhattan still glistened from the rain while cold wind curled through the avenues carrying the smell of wet concrete and roasted chestnuts from a distant vendor packing up for the night. Ethan Blackwood stood beneath the restaurant awning watching her walk away in those same weathered shoes. He could have gone home hours ago. His penthouse overlooking Central Park waited 30 blocks north with heated floors, imported whiskey, and floor-to-ceiling windows worth more than most apartment buildings in the city. Instead, he found himself staring at a woman disappearing into the night beside puddles reflecting broken neon lights. Something inside him refused to leave. Claire walked 3 blocks before stopping near a small 24-hour grocery store. Ethan remained across the street without approaching. He told himself he was simply curious. But deep down, curiosity had already become something else. Claire entered the store quietly and emerged 10 minutes later, carrying 2 grocery bags filled mostly with canned soup, bread, medicine, and bottled water. Ethan frowned slightly. At this hour? In this neighborhood? She continued walking downtown instead of toward the subway. The farther she went, the less Manhattan resembled the polished version printed on postcards. The luxury towers disappeared. So did the bright restaurants and glowing boutiques. Storefront gates rattled softly in the wind while old brick buildings stood silent beneath flickering streetlights. Claire finally stopped outside a small church shelter near 10th Avenue. Ethan recognized it immediately. St. Andrew's Outreach Center. He had passed it countless times without ever noticing it. Claire knocked softly before an elderly volunteer opened the side door. Warm yellow light spilled onto the sidewalk. "Claire," the woman whispered with relief. "Thank goodness." Claire lifted the grocery bags slightly with a tired smile. "I brought what you texted me." Ethan stayed hidden near the corner while several people inside the shelter greeted Claire quietly as she entered. Not with the exaggerated gratitude people showed wealthy donors. With familiarity, affection. One little boy ran toward her immediately holding a drawing in his small hands. Claire crouched down despite obvious exhaustion and listened to him speak with complete attention, like nothing else in the world mattered more than whatever story he was telling. Ethan watched through the church windows while cold wind moved around him unnoticed. An older man sitting near the entrance shook Claire's hand gently before she passed him medicine from one of the bags. Then she disappeared deeper inside toward the kitchen area. No cameras, no press, no audience. Ethan suddenly remembered every charity gala he had ever attended. Crystal chandeliers, photographers, giant donation checks held beneath bright lights while executives congratulated one another over champagne. Yet this tiny church shelter felt more honest than all of them combined. He looked down at his reflection in a rain puddle near the curb. Expensive coat, Italian shoes, perfect image. Earlier that evening, he had laughed at Claire's worn flats while sitting beneath chandeliers discussing investment portfolios. Now he stood alone outside a homeless shelter realizing he had never once used his own hands to carry groceries for strangers. The realization settled painfully deep. After nearly 40 minutes, Claire finally emerged from the shelter carrying empty grocery bags folded neatly beneath one arm. She looked exhausted now, the kind of exhaustion that lived in the bones. Ethan stepped forward before he could reconsider. Claire froze briefly when she saw him beneath the streetlight. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked quietly. Ethan suddenly felt absurd standing there in a $7,000 coat outside a church shelter after following a waitress through Manhattan. "I was heading this direction," he lied badly. Claire looked at him for several silent seconds. Then her eyes drifted once toward the empty grocery bags. She knew. Somehow that embarrassed him more than being caught. "You followed me," she said softly. Not angry, just truthful. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yes." Claire stared at him beneath the pale streetlight, while distant sirens echoed somewhere uptown. "Why?" Ethan opened his mouth, then paused, because he no longer fully understood the answer himself. "I think," he admitted carefully, "I wanted to see if you were real." Claire blinked once, caught off guard by the honesty. Cold wind moved loose strands of blonde hair across her face. Ethan noticed she looked younger without the restaurant lights and uniform. More fragile somehow, yet still steady. "And?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked toward the church shelter behind her. "I think I have spent most of my life around people pretending to care." Claire lowered her eyes briefly. "That sounds lonely." The sentence landed harder than any insult could have. Ethan laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it. "You know what is strange?" he said quietly. "Earlier tonight, I thought those shoes told me everything about you." Claire glanced down at the worn leather standing in shallow rainwater. "Most people think that." Ethan shook his head faintly. "But now I think they say more about me." Claire looked up slowly. Ethan could not remember the last time he had spoken this honestly to anyone. Boardrooms rewarded certainty. Investors rewarded confidence. But standing beneath a flickering streetlight outside a church shelter at nearly 2 in the morning, certainty suddenly felt smaller than kindness. Claire adjusted the strap of her canvas bag gently against her shoulder. People become dangerous when they believe money makes them better observers of humanity. Ethan studied her quietly. "And what do you think money actually does?" Claire looked toward the glowing church windows before answering. "It usually just makes people louder." Silence drifted softly between them while steam rose from a nearby subway grate. Ethan Blackwood stood motionless in the cold Manhattan night, realizing that for the first time in years, someone had spoken to him without fear, without ambition, and without wanting anything in return. Claire Bennett and Ethan Blackwood stood beneath the pale glow of the streetlight while the city moved quietly around them. Somewhere above the avenue, An elevated train thundered briefly through the darkness before fading again into the sleeping rhythm of Manhattan. Claire shifted the empty grocery bags gently in her hands. "It is late, Mr. Blackwood." Ethan looked toward her. "You can call me Ethan." Claire hesitated for half a second. "That feels dangerous." He almost smiled. "Why?" Her eyes drifted toward the luxury watch beneath his coat sleeve. "Because men like you are usually temporary experiences." The honesty caught him off guard again. Ethan spent most of his life in side rooms where every sentence had strategy hidden beneath it. Claire spoke like someone too tired to perform. "And women like you?" he asked quietly. Claire looked toward the church shelter windows glowing behind her. "We usually do not have the luxury of being temporary." Cold winds swept between the buildings, lifting loose strands of her blonde hair across her face. Ethan noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes now. Exhaustion. Real exhaustion. The kind no expensive vacation fixed. "How long have you worked at Bellamy's?" he asked. "Almost 3 years." "Before that?" Claire smiled faintly. "Other restaurants." "And before that?" She grew quiet for a moment. "College." Ethan studied her carefully. "You finished?" Claire shook her head once. "Life interrupted." Ethan recognized the sentence immediately because wealthy people never used it. Wealthy people called interruptions opportunities. Everyone else called them survival. "What were you studying?" he asked. Claire looked almost embarrassed by the answer. "Social work." Ethan blinked once. Somehow that made perfect sense. "You wanted to help people." Claire adjusted the strap of her bag slightly. "I wanted people to feel seen." Ethan stared at her while neon reflections trembled across the wet sidewalk between them. He suddenly remembered his first years in finance. Back when success still felt connected to building something meaningful instead of simply winning. Somewhere along the way, numbers had become easier to manage than humanity. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Not finishing?" Claire thought for a second before answering. "I regret how expensive kindness can become for people without money." The sentence settled deeply inside him. Ethan looked away toward the empty avenue. A homeless man pushed a shopping cart slowly along the opposite sidewalk, while expensive apartment towers rose silently above him like another world entirely. Manhattan had always looked powerful to Ethan. Tonight it looked divided. "You know," Claire said softly, "most rich people are terrified." Ethan turned back toward her. "Terrified of what?" "Being unnecessary." He frowned slightly. "That sounds dramatic." Claire shook her head gently. "No, it sounds lonely." Ethan laughed once under his breath. "You make billionaires sound fragile." Claire finally smiled a little. "Everyone is fragile. Money just hides it better." Silence drifted between them again. Ethan realized he had not wanted to check his phone for nearly an hour now. No market updates. No emails. No negotiations. Just cold air and honest conversation outside a church shelter at 2 in the morning with a woman wearing taped shoes. Somehow it felt more real than most of his life. A black town car slowly approached the curb behind him. His driver stepped out immediately holding an umbrella. "Mr. Blackwood," the man said respectfully. "Your mother has called 3 times." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "I will call her back." The driver hesitated after noticing Claire. Then he quietly returned to the car. Claire watched the exchange silently. "Someone is worried about you," she said. Ethan looked toward the glowing skyline downtown. "People worry about losing access to me." Claire studied him carefully beneath the streetlight. "That is not the same thing." He met her eyes. "No, it is not." For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The city hummed softly around them while steam curled upward from the subway grates beside the sidewalk. Ethan noticed Claire shivering slightly in the cold despite trying not to show it. Without thinking, he removed his coat and held it toward her. Claire immediately stepped back. "No, Claire, no, Ethan." It was the first time she had used his name. Softly, carefully. Somehow it sounded more intimate than flirting ever could. "You are cold," he said. Claire folded her arms lightly against herself. "I am careful." Ethan lowered the coat slowly. "There is a difference?" Claire nodded. Cold passes. Her eyes drifted toward the church shelter behind her again. "Depending on people can stay with you." Ethan felt that sentence more than he expected to. His entire empire had been built on convincing people they needed him, while secretly avoiding needing anyone himself. Claire Bennett somehow saw through him with terrifying ease. "You really think money makes people louder?" he asked after a moment. Claire smiled faintly. "Sometimes." "And me?" She looked directly into his eyes then. Calm, honest, unafraid. I think you have spent so long being listened to that you forgot how to hear people. The words should have offended him. Instead, they landed like truth finally spoken out loud. Ethan looked down briefly at the rainwater near his polished shoes. Earlier that night, he had laughed at hers. Now his own suddenly felt strangely empty. Claire glanced toward the church clock above the shelter entrance. I should go. Ethan nodded slowly, though something inside him resisted the moment ending. Claire adjusted the canvas bag against her shoulder and started walking toward the subway entrance at the corner. Then she paused briefly beneath the flickering light without turning around. For what it is worth, she said softly into the cold Manhattan night, I do not think you are a bad man. Ethan lifted his eyes toward her. Claire finally looked back over her shoulder. Just a very expensive, lonely one. Then she disappeared down the subway stairs while Ethan Blackwood stood motionless beneath the sleeping city, listening to the distant echo of her footsteps fade into the underground silence. The next evening, Manhattan glowed gold beneath a clear winter sky as people hurried through the streets wrapped in coats and conversations and lives too busy to notice one another. Inside Bellamy's steakhouse, the dinner crowd had already begun filling the dining room with soft laughter and the sound of clinking glasses beneath crystal chandeliers. Claire Bennett stood near the service station adjusting the sleeve of her uniform while Olivia stared at her with narrowed eyes. You look tired. Claire offered a faint smile. I slept 4 hours. That is practically luxury. Olivia leaned closer. Was he waiting outside for you last night? Claire paused briefly while arranging silverware. Who? Olivia gave her a look. Claire. Claire sighed softly. Yes. Olivia nearly dropped the wine menu in her hands. And Claire placed the final fork carefully beside the folded napkins. And he listened. Olivia blinked once. That is somehow more shocking than flirting. Claire laughed quietly under her breath, but her smile faded when she noticed something near the hostess stand. A large white box rested on the marble counter wrapped with a simple black ribbon. No logo. No card visible. Did somebody leave that? Claire asked. The hostess nodded. A delivery came about 20 minutes ago. They said it was for you. Claire frowned slightly and walked toward the box while Olivia followed immediately behind her with obvious curiosity. The restaurant lights reflected softly against the white packaging as Claire untied the ribbon carefully. Inside rested a pair of elegant black leather shoes. Beautiful, simple, timeless. The kind designed quietly expensive people preferred. Claire stared at them without touching them. Olivia whispered softly, Oh my God. Beneath the shoes sat a folded note written in careful handwriting. Claire opened it slowly. For the woman who walked farther than all of us. Claire's expression softened instantly because she recognized the handwriting. Ethan. Olivia looked between the note and the shoes with wide eyes. Those probably cost more than my rent. Claire smiled faintly before closing the box again. Probably. You are not even going to try them on. Claire looked down at her worn shoes beneath the restaurant lights. The leather still carried faint marks from rain and wine and winter streets. No, Olivia stared at her like she had lost her mind. Claire, those are beautiful. I know. Then why not? Claire ran her fingers gently across the edge of the white box. Because some gifts are apologies. Olivia frowned slightly. And that is bad. Claire looked toward the restaurant entrance quietly. Not bad. Her voice softened. Just unfinished. At that exact moment, the front doors opened. Ethan Blackwood stepped inside beneath the warm glow of Bellamy's chandeliers wearing a charcoal coat dusted lightly with snow. Conversation shifted subtly around the dining room the way it always did when powerful people entered a room. But tonight Ethan noticed none of it. His eyes found Claire almost immediately near the hostess stand beside the unopened shoes. He stopped walking. Claire looked at him calmly across the restaurant. Not smiling. Not upset. Just steady. Ethan approached slowly while Olivia disappeared toward the kitchen with the survival instincts of someone avoiding emotional crossfire. I was not sure you would get them before your shift, Ethan said quietly. Claire glanced down at the white box once more. They are beautiful. Relief flickered briefly across his face. Good. Then Claire gently closed the lid again. Ethan noticed immediately. You do not like them? Claire met his eyes softly. That is not the problem. Around them, wealthy diners continued eating expensive meals beneath golden lights, completely unaware that the most important conversation in the room had nothing to do with money. Ethan slid his hands into his coat pockets slowly. Then what is the problem? Claire looked down at her old shoes for a moment before answering. You bought new ones because you felt guilty for mocking the old ones. Ethan opened his mouth, then stopped, because she was right. Claire's voice remained calm. But guilt and understanding are not the same thing. Silence stretched quietly between them. Ethan glanced toward the white box. I was trying to make things right. Claire nodded faintly. I know. And Claire looked toward the crowded dining room. Men in tailored suits laughing over $1,000 bottles of wine. Women adjusting diamond bracelets beneath chandelier light. A world Ethan understood perfectly. People spend so much time replacing things, she said softly. Shoes, phones, relationships, employees. Her eyes returned to his. But very few people stop long enough to ask why something mattered in the first place. Ethan felt those words settle deep inside him. Claire stepped slightly closer then, lowering her voice beneath the soft piano music drifting through the restaurant. Those shoes carried me through the hardest year of my life. Ethan listened silently. They walked through snow when I thought nobody cared whether I survived. Her fingers brushed lightly against the worn leather near her feet. They remind me that kindness still exists even when life becomes cruel. Ethan looked down slowly at the old shoes he once laughed at. Suddenly, the polished Italian leather on his own feet felt meaningless. Claire gave him a small, tired smile. You cannot replace something that became part of somebody's story. The restaurant lights reflected softly in Ethan's eyes while he stood motionless in the center of Bellamy's steakhouse, understanding for the first time that the most valuable things in life were usually the ones people carried quietly.